Welcome to Human Monsters. Velma Barfield was born in Eastover, North Carolina on October 29th, 1932, to Murphy and Lillian Bullard. Her mother gave birth without the assistance of medical professionals. It was just her father and sister who provided as much help as they could. She was born into a multi-generational household with not only her parents, but grandparents and her disabled aunt. Her grandparents died when she was 4 years old, an event she could not recall later in life. Murphy was a very hard worker, but during the Great Depression, the family only managed to scrape by, despite his employment at a sawmill and his upkeep of the family farm. The fact that he frequently worked overtime at the mill and still struggled financially caused him a great deal of frustration and rage. One belief that causes us all to suffer emotionally is the notion that everybody gets what they deserve. As far as the fruits of Murphy's labors went, they were slim pickings. About town, Murphy had a reputation as considerate, kind, and industrious. At home, he was an entirely different person. He would lash out based on even the most minor infraction or inconvenience, and more often than not, he expressed his displeasure with his fists. The abuse was not species-specific. He owned a pack of hunting dogs, and if any of them disobeyed him or annoyed him in any way, he would kick, punch, or even stomp on them. He would beat the children with his belt. Occasionally, the children would be lined up and undergo lashings as an assembly line formation. Velma didn't take her beatings quietly. She would resist as much as she could and was never shy about voicing her objections. She did not suffer to his satisfaction. Even with the threat of more lashes, she did not take it without a fight. Murphy pronounced that she had a, quote, smart mouth. Not only did Velma despise her father for the abuse, but she resented her mother for her failure to intervene. She felt that a mother is responsible for protecting her children, who have a right to feel safe in their home. It was a classic dysfunctional household, and the abuse Velma suffered inflicted irreversible damage. Even when her age was in single digits, Velma was always preoccupied with the idea of escaping from her family. At the age of 7, the solutions for this problem were not immediately apparent. It was only in 1939, when she began school, that she finally got a respite from all the drama at home. Unlike her classmates, she dreaded the moment when school ended for the day or for holidays. Her scholastic and behavioral reputation were good overall, but she inherited her father's temper, and if she were slighted in any way, she would react, most often verbally. Velma also felt insecure because the other students were better dressed than her. Since her family struggled just to stay fed, Velma wore old, tattered clothing and shoes. There was no cafeteria in the school, so the students had to brown bag it. The other children would bring sandwiches and treats, like cookies. Velma would bring a slab of cornbread and a sausage. When her alumni saw what she was eating, they would bully and ostracize her. So much so, she took to eating outdoors in the woods. The humiliation of a life of privation inspired Velma to take baby steps to a life of crime. She began by stealing money from her father's pockets. She feared him, but also hated him enough to pilfer money for snacks. She would eat the snacks at school, feeling good that she was able to outdo her fellow alumni in quantity. Velma began to branch out as a criminal, and she was seen wandering around a neighbor's property. It was soon discovered that $80 in cash was missing from the house. Velma was found to be in possession of the money. When Murphy beat Velma viciously, she tried to extricate herself by claiming her neighbor asked her to hold the money for him. But that pathetic attempt at deception was almost laughable. It was only in her teens when her father began to express tenderness, calling her honey and sugar. He even bought her a stylish dress she had been coveting. Murphy forbade Velma from dating before the age of 16, but she would sneak around with boys. He also instituted a curfew of 10 p.m. This she abided by. She didn't get the belt at that point, but Murphy would lecture for hours on end and would create more rules. Unable to take the harsh discipline and draconian rules any longer, Velma left the family. She explained in a note she left behind that she simply did not want to live with them anymore. Murphy was outraged and angry, and he demanded his wife Lillian join him in searching for Velma. When they found her, Murphy, despite a long tirade of yelling and screaming at her, managed to persuade her to get in the car and go back home. When they returned, Velma got the belt, only it was not Murphy who issued the beating this time. It was Lillian. Velma was told afterwards that she was grounded and was not to see Thomas Burke anymore, a boy she had been dating. Velma would find a way to see Thomas on the sly. Once she turned 17, Murphy gave his consent for her to openly see Thomas. He would go on to regret this decision, for Thomas and Velma eloped in another state. Murphy was outraged and insisted that the marriage be annulled. There was nothing he could do about it, however, because Velma moved out and was living as an independent woman. She dropped out of school and got a job. Her father no longer had any jurisdiction when it came to the most pivotal decisions of her life. Thomas and Velma worked manual labor and customer service jobs until Thomas ordered Velma to stay home and be a housewife. He also wanted her fully available in the event that they have children. Their son Ronald was born on December 15th, 1951. She delighted in the unconditional love the boy showed her. The couple would have a daughter named Pamela on September 3rd, 1953. Thomas allowed Velma to go back to work, and she accepted a position at a textile plant. She intended to use the money to benefit her children in any way she could. She was determined that they would have a much happier childhood than she did. In the early 60s, Thomas got a job driving truck for Pepsi, and the family's financial standing saw a marked improvement. They were even able to move into a more spacious home, with a backyard for child play and barbecues. 1963. At the age of 30, Velma woke up one day to find that she was bleeding profusely from her vagina. A doctor examined her and discovered the presence of fibroid tumors growing from her uterus. She was informed that she would need a hysterectomy. She and Thomas hadn't intended to have more children, so the fact that the procedure would render her infertile was not a concern for them. What did become problematic were the after effects of the surgery. The procedure caused a hormonal imbalance, and Velma suffered from anxiety and depression. Thomas and the kids had to become hypervigilant due to her frequent and unpredictable mood swings, which often led her to lash out with rage. It was about that time that she began to put on weight, and she was very insecure about it. She asked her doctor to prescribe her diet pills. The emotional impact of the drug made her mood swings even worse. Piling atop all this mania, she took pain pills for a bad back later on. Not only was she mentally unstable at this point, but she became an addict. One day she blacked out from her intake of drugs while in her car. She drove the car into a neighbor's yard and nearly into their house. She would go on to take Valium, further adding to the cocktail that was impacting her psychiatric problems. Velma's marriage to Thomas deteriorated. She was impossible to live with at this point due to her psychiatric issues. She found out he sought solace in a social club where he often drank. Despite her own history with substance abuse, Velma was outraged by Thomas's drinking. Thomas was not an alcoholic, but Velma didn't want him to even have one drink because Murphy had been a heavy drinker. Velma was belligerent and always keen to pick a fight with Thomas. The death of Thomas's father led to even more marital turmoil, so much so that their children tried to stay out of the house as much as possible because it had become a dysfunctional war zone. Ironically, they sought refuge in Murphy's home. He had been an abusive tyrant to his own kids, but a loving and indulgent grandfather. Velma had become what she despised in her father. One day a liquor bottle fell on the floor and shattered. A meticulous housekeeper, Velma swept up the glass and then placed the shards in front of the couch where Thomas passed out. He was barefoot. If a shard of glass had gouged open an artery, he could have bled out. Fortunately, he didn't sustain any injuries. Thomas's drinking became more frequent, and he developed a dependency. He was even charged with a DUI one day. He was lucky. He only got a suspended sentence, and his license was invalidated. Having no driver's license was a hardship for Thomas. He had to rely on friends and coworkers to get to work. Thomas was drinking more than ever to cope with his situation. Velma continued to bait him into screaming matches. He eventually refused to engage her in fighting and would ignore her. Even when she got within an inch of his face and screamed, he would look beyond her and take a sip of his beer. Another irony. Velma felt Thomas needed intervention from the psychiatric establishment and had him committed forcefully. When he was released, he became paranoid and withdrawn due to the fact that the town they lived in was small and gossip was rampant. 1967. Velma would demonstrate a need for psychiatric intervention in her own right, for she had a breakdown at this time. Once the doctors put a stop to her anxiety, they prescribed medication for her, this atop of everything else she was taking. 1969. The 60s ended on a tragic note for the Burke family when Thomas was burned to death in the house. Speculation had it that he fell asleep with a cigarette in his hand while drunk. Velma arrived right before he died and summoned first responders. Thomas's death was chalked up to smoke inhalation and ruled as accidental. Very little time had passed when Velma announced to her son Ronnie that she was getting married again. It was 1970, just about a year after Thomas died. Jennings Barfield was her new fiancé. Ronnie approved of their engagement, feeling that it might lead to Velma becoming more stable emotionally and kicking her drug habit. Pamela was not nearly as supportive, feeling that it was somehow disloyal of her to move on to another man so soon after Thomas's death. Aside from that, she was more concerned for Jennings Barfield's well-being, recalling the turmoil that Thomas went through with her mother, the marital dysfunction that literally drove him to drink. She even met with Barfield privately to warn him about her mother. He could not be convinced that his new fiancée posed a threat to him and went on his merry way. August 23rd, 1970. Velma became Mrs. Jennings Barfield. Jennings was 54 years old, and his 16-year-old daughter lived with him when Velma moved in. Ronnie and Pamela moved in with their grandparents. Some last vestiges of Velma's mental illness remained. Ronnie didn't have money for university tuition, but Velma told him that Jennings would send payment to an institution in South Carolina. When Ronnie showed up at the school, he was informed that his tuition had not been paid. When he called home, Jennings was mystified when he was informed that he was expected to pay Ronnie's tuition fees. It was a sign that his mother had not yet returned to reality. Ronnie elected to join the military. 1971. Ronnie received a phone call from Velma. She was distraught, announcing that Jennings passed away. She expected Ronnie to remain stateside so that he could support her. Ronnie lobbied the Army to allow him to postpone his training, citing Velma's need for his presence, but they refused. Velma felt cheated by the government for that reason. In the meantime, unable to live independently, Velma moved back in with her parents. Murphy began to suffer various health problems, possibly due to the stress of living with somebody who is mentally unstable. In fact, he suffered so much chronic illness during that time, he had to take a leave of absence from work to recover. Lillian struggled in her own right to deal with Velma. At times, Velma would be catatonic from the psychiatric medication she was taking, which was usually indicative of an overdose. That circumstance was hardly ideal, but it was at least a respite from her episodes of mania. Velma told a therapist that the overdose was a suicide attempt because she didn't want to live to experience the death of her son from fighting in Vietnam. She was convinced that if a doctor could write a letter stating that her son's deployment to the war was causing her suicidal ideation, he might be honorably discharged, with the ultimate outcome being that she could depend on him to keep her going. Ronnie indulged his mother to the extent that he appealed to the Army's administration to keep him home. They compromised and stationed him at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. April 15th, 1973. Murphy died from lung cancer. Velma's life went into further decline when the house she owned with Jennings went into foreclosure due to her failure to make the payments. Velma was admitted to another psychiatric hospital. During her stay, Velma befriended 60-year-old Al Smith, a construction worker who was being treated for alcoholism. She relentlessly belittled Thomas for his problem drinking, but somehow it was okay for Al. When Velma left the hospital, she moved back in with her widowed mother. Eventually, Velma got a job and moved out of her mother's house into a small apartment, much to Lillian's relief. Ronnie had been dating a woman named Joanna, and he announced to his mother at one point that he was engaged to marry her. Velma was not at all pleased. In fact, she was outright apoplectic. She went on a tirade, informed, as she was, by the invisible clouded crystal ball that predicted he would abandon her wholesale. She was even petty enough to criticize him for the pricey engagement ring he bought for his fiancée. She told him that he could have spent all that money on her. It seemed as if the apron strings were about to be refashioned into a slip knot. He did his utmost to reassure her that he would make time for her when possible, but she didn't buy it. Perhaps in an effort to instill a guilt trip and distract Ronnie during his February wedding, Velma overdosed on pills and went into a coma, during which she was attached to a respirator shortly before the ceremony. Ultimately, Velma was so narcissistic that she couldn't grasp that the needs of others are important, too. She decided it was a completely rational thing to do to martyr herself for the sake of that narcissism. Sadly for Ronnie, he blamed himself for his mother's condition, even beating himself up over the fact that he dared to marry a woman on his ailing mother's watch. Eventually, Ronnie grew tired of the ways in which his mother controlled his life, and he gave her a stern talking to, during which he advised her to get her life together. He told her he was going to marry Joanna whether she objected or not. Velma attended the ceremony, and, to Ronnie's relief, she behaved herself. Ronnie's hopes that his mother would get her life together were dashed when he received a phone call one night from the county jail. His mother was charged with forgery. She tried to refill a prescription forging a doctor's signature. She pled guilty, received a suspended sentence, and a $100 fine. Echoing Ronnie, perhaps the judge advised Velma to get her act together because the court would not be so merciful the next time around. Meanwhile, Ronnie was discharged from the army, a development that greatly pleased Velma, assuming, as she did, that she could then get her hooks into him for good. He began working and attending university classes. He had a hobby at the time, golfing. He wound up being so good at golf, he was able to quit his straight job and play golf professionally. Things were looking up for him and Joanna. While Ronnie was showing himself to be a productive citizen, Velma was still struggling to scotch tape her life together. She was living with Lillian again. She could never hold down a job for long. She had her second brush with the law for forgery, though not for a prescription. This time it was for passing a bad check. This time around, she served a 30-day jail sentence. This punishment didn't keep her straight for long. She forged her mother's name on checks so she could get her hands on more drugs. Lillian didn't know how to deal with it, and she didn't want to get the law involved. By 1974, Velma had bottomed out. She was unemployed, addicted, and living with her mother. Her mother could not bring herself to throw Velma out, but she sure didn't appreciate that her adult child was causing so many problems for her. Velma became indignant when Lillian asked her to do chores, which added even more strain to their relationship. Certainly, if you ask your grown daughter to do some laundry and she starts screaming and throwing clothing all over the house, you would find yourself at the end of your rope. Then again, Velma wasn't thrilled about the dumpster fire she called her life. Ronnie was quoted as saying, "I think there was more anger in my mom than I had ever seen, and it was a different type than I had seen before, all directed at my grandmother. She just seemed to have a lot of resentment. She resented having to depend on her mother." Her financial standing saw an improvement when Al Smith suddenly died. He bequeathed some of his estate to her as the sole beneficiary of his life insurance policy. This came as a surprise to many, since she had only been dating him for a short time. Given her track record for forgery, speculation had it that she might have diverted the money to herself through fraudulent means, though there was no evidence to buttress that theory. She received a check for $5,000, approximately $31,000 when adjusted for inflation. She was too irresponsible to handle such a largesse with maturity, and by Christmas she had squandered all the money on drugs. Velma was penniless and took the tack of taking out a loan on her mother's car. Lillian was unaware of this until she received a notice in the mail informing her that she was expected to make payments. Lillian wouldn't be around to see the consequences of Velma's actions, for she suddenly fell ill. Velma called up relatives, telling them Lillian was coughing up blood. By the time Ronnie arrived at the hospital, Lillian was dead. Velma's resentment of her mother melted away and gave way to tears. Velma more or less demanded that all his grief and sympathy be directed at her. Velma was in rough shape following the death of her mother. She was still in no condition to support herself, and Ronnie and Pamela would take turns letting her stay with them. She caused them many stressful moments with her overdoses. The police also had a warrant out for her arrest for yet another forgery charge. Pamela had had enough and decided to stop helping her mother. Velma showed herself to be incapable of redemption, and allowing her to bring her chaos into her home was doing Pamela no favors. Sure enough, when Velma begged Pamela to rescue her from her latest clusterfuck, Pamela refused. She said to Velma, "You got into this. I tried to help you, and you wouldn't listen. Now you'll have to get out of it yourself." Ronnie followed Pamela's lead and refused to bail Velma out of jail the next time she was detained. Both he and Pamela felt that the environment of jail, with its 24-hour supervision and strict discipline, might be the antidote to their mother's emotional instability and drug addiction. March 21st, 1975. Velma stood before a judge, likely more sober than she had been in years. That sentencing hearing was not the end of the line, however, and she was sentenced to 6 months in the North Carolina Correctional Center for Women in Raleigh. In prison, Velma complained to the doctors of the withdrawal symptoms she was experiencing. They prescribed Valium. This did nothing to alleviate her addiction, and she was also released after about 3 months. June 30th, 1976. Velma was released. Her family hoped that her time in prison might have cured her of her problems with addiction. She told them it did and promised to do what she could to get her life on track. She admitted that the best years of her life were put to waste because of her drug problem. This was a hollow vow. She overdosed in a week and was back in the hospital. Nothing had changed for Velma or Ronnie and Pamela. Velma even reverted to her old pattern of forging checks. This time the victim was Pamela's husband, Kirby. This after he allowed her to live in their home during her time of hardship. The entire family staged an intervention. Ronnie confronted her about her behavior, and Velma begged for another chance. She cried and wailed, begging them not to take an action that would lead to her serving more time in prison. Kirby hadn't learned about the forgeries, and Ronnie convinced Pamela to pay off what Velma stole to prevent more conflict. Her probation officer arranged for her to live in a halfway house in Charlotte, North Carolina. She begged her children to keep her from living in the halfway house. She knew the halfway house's staff would not tolerate her drug use and would monitor her closely to ensure she was not using. They caved, and Velma moved in with Pamela. Velma procured a legitimate source of income, working as a live-in caregiver for an elderly woman. The woman had fallen to mental decline, and Velma found it hard to cope with. She began to self-medicate, or at least that is what she would have called it as she went back to taking the same drugs she was addicted to. 1976. The woman Velma was taking care of was placed in a nursing home. The woman's mother was pleased enough with Velma's performance that she referred her to another patient. This time it was a man, Montgomery Edwards. The man was suffering from complications of diabetes at the age of 94. He had gone blind and lost both of his legs. He was entirely dependent on others for his basic needs. Velma received free room and board and a weekly paycheck of $75. When Pamela checked in on her mother, she found that she was enjoying the job, which included spending time with Montgomery's wife, Dolly. Velma met Montgomery's nephew, Stuart Taylor, and they hit it off immediately. She was soon smitten with him. They went on dates regularly. At one point, this bright spot in her life came to an end when Stuart, who had been separated from his estranged wife, decided to get back together with her. Though she put on a front of taking it in stride initially, her work suffered as her moods affected her performance, and she got into arguments with Dolly about her duties. January 29th, 1977. Montgomery Edwards died. Dolly was generous enough to Velma to let her stay at her home for a while. At that point, she was basically just a maid. Nevertheless, Dolly could be an exacting tyrant, and Velma became resentful. After all, this is the same woman who threw laundry around in a tirade when her mother asked her to wash some clothing. This situation wouldn't trouble Velma much longer, though. For about a month after Montgomery's demise, Dolly wound up dead. On February 26th, she began vomiting and experiencing excruciating stomach pain. She went to the hospital and was discharged. The pain and other symptoms did not diminish, and she was taken to the hospital again. She died in intensive care. Velma now had no place to live. As usual, whenever she hit rock bottom, it was incumbent upon her adult children to figure out a plan so she would have a soft spot to land. Fortunately for them, only a week passed before the pastor from Velma's church called to inform her that a local woman named Record Lee had a broken leg from a fall. Record was 76 and her husband John Henry was 80, and neither one of them could keep house. Velma didn't hesitate to take advantage of this opportunity. Things went well until Record discovered that a check had been forged in her name. John reported it to the police. Shortly after submitting the report, He became deathly ill. He became extremely nauseous with stomach pains. He would die on June 4th of that year. Velma was very supportive to their relatives, and they insisted that she stay on to continue to assist Record with her needs. Record would get sick and stay in hospital for a time. When she was discharged, Velma informed her she wouldn't be working for her anymore and beat a new path. Stuart Taylor suddenly reemerged in Velma's life. He told her he and his soon-to-be ex-wife were finalizing their divorce and he wanted Velma back. Velma and Stuart became serious again, going on regular dates, even spending entire weekends in hotel rooms. They eventually moved in together. If there was ever a honeymoon period for the couple, it was short-lived. They soon began to bicker and fight on a regular basis. Velma was no more suited to intimacy than she was to living on the right side of the law, and this was demonstrated when she began forging checks again. This time she was forging Stuart's name. When he found out later in the month, he was enraged. The two had been engaged, but their relationship didn't survive this incident. Velma moved out and into Pamela's home. Relations broke down between the two women, and Velma shacked up with Ronnie. Ronnie reached a boiling point and told Velma he just couldn't put up with her bullshit anymore. He and Joanna had a son named Michael, and their hands were full looking after his needs. Not only was Velma unable to see the truth in this, but she flew into a rage, accusing Ronnie of betraying her. Ronnie recalled that she shot him a look he had never seen on her, the kind of look you would give if your killer instincts were surfacing. For a time, Velma was without a residence of her own. She would live at Pamela's home for a while, and then she would stay with Stuart for a time. During her stay at Stuart's home, she was introduced to his daughter, Alice. She had had a baby boy named William, and Stuart decided to show him off to Velma. It was on that same occasion that they were looking through old family photographs. Velma requested that the family show her what was referred to by them as the dead photo. It was a photograph of Stuart lying on his back on a couch with his arms folded in front of him. Stuart's pose was tongue-in-cheek, and the photo was taken as a joke. Alice recalled years later how chilling it was that Velma wanted to see that particular picture above all others. The reason for that reaction will soon be revealed. One night, Stuart and Velma went out to a church service. In the middle of the service, Stuart became nauseous. He excused himself to go outside. From that day forward, Stuart suffered nausea and stomach pains. He vomited frequently. This gave way to organ failure. His condition deteriorated to the point where he was taken to hospital, where he expired soon thereafter. He was 56 years old and known to be in good health, so the sudden turn toward terminal illness was unexpected and puzzling. An autopsy was performed by one Dr. Jordan, who detected the presence of arsenic. There were chunks of it in Stuart's liver. This was telling, considering that Stuart would not have voluntarily ingested arsenic. It was the doctor's conclusion that he had been poisoned. Detectives felt strongly that the only person who would be inclined to poison Stuart was someone who was close to him. Examining all his closest associates, they narrowed in on Velma Barfield, who was known to have a history of mental illness, drug addiction, and criminality. They also observed a pattern of sudden deaths in her personal history. Her first husband, Thomas. Alice Smith also died suddenly from an accident. She got to cash in on that one with the insurance payout. It was Jennings whose death was most similar to that of Stewart, an untimely demise following a short spate of illness. Both men experienced extreme gastrointestinal distress prior to their deaths. She happened to be around when her parents died, and Montgomery Edwards along with his wife. Velma was brought into the police station for questioning. They hoped some shock tactics would get her to confess. They demanded to know how Stewart's body became so saturated with arsenic. She claimed she was a victim by proxy in that scenario, and that she only wanted to help Stewart. She complained about the detectives' aggressive pursuit of the truth, feeling that they were unfairly pressuring her. At times, she would plead ignorance and claim that she didn't know how the arsenic made its way into his system. One of the officers proposed that she undertake a polygraph exam, and she agreed to do it. The officers noted that the part of the test that most gave Velma pause was when she was questioned about all the deaths that had occurred going back to her parents. They recalled that she had a sharp look on her face before looking away. Alice was understandably outraged when she found out that Velma had likely poisoned her father. She and her relatives were further infuriated when they found out Velma used arsenic. Arsenic is used to make rat poison, and it was insulting to Alice and her family that Velma exterminated her father as if he, too, were vermin, a pest to be rid of. Velma forged a check under Stewart's name and cashed it the day before he died. Detectives decided this was the surest sign that she was the prime suspect in his murder. March 14, 1978. A public defender was appointed to represent Velma Barfield since she was charged with first-degree murder. She pled not guilty by reason of insanity. Her lawyer, Bob Jacobson, was the first person to whom she confessed. She admitted to killing Stewart Taylor and others. She didn't disclose the tally of her body count in toto, nor did she reveal all the names of the victims. It was about this time that Pamela recalled a chilling incident that occurred while Velma was staying at her house. Velma requested the use of Pamela's car. Pamela declined, cognizant as she was that Velma was likely to use the car to buy drugs, and she had already crashed a car, so it was not in Pamela's best wishes to grant this request. Later that evening, Pamela and Kirby became nauseous and both vomited. At the time, they assumed it was something they ate. As Pamela would eventually realize, she was right. Velma poisoned her food as revenge for refusing to loan her the car. Kirby recalled that some tea served to him and Pamela by Velma tasted odd. November 27th, 1978. Velma Barfield's trial began. She should have pled guilty, since there was plenty of witnesses to testify to the effect that Stewart Taylor did indeed suffer the effects of arsenic poisoning, complete with convulsions and extreme pain in his stomach, liver, and intestines. His children, 2 doctors, and a paramedic further buttressed this finding due to what they witnessed firsthand. Velma elected to take the stand herself, which proved to be foolhardy. She claimed it was never her intention to kill anyone, only to make them sick. Her hope was that by putting forward this assertion, the charge would be dropped to second-degree murder. Naturally, the prosecutors and the rest of the court didn't go for it. Velma's attorney insisted that her long-term abuse of drugs had inflicted so much damage on her neurologically and psychologically that it affected her ability to make sound judgments and even disconnected her from reality. Her admission that she didn't tell hospital staff that she poisoned Stewart was an admission of perjury. It didn't help that while she was cross-examined by the prosecutor, she came across as defensive and irate, giving the impression that her word was gospel. Even Ronnie admitted this, saying, "She seemed to have no remorse about what she had done. I saw a mean person, a callous person, who didn't seem to care what happened." Velma Barfield was found guilty of murder in the first degree and was sentenced to death. Velma became a model inmate during her time in prison. She became a born-again Christian. She even had some communication with the televangelist Billy Graham, who lobbied the government to commute her sentence to a life term without success. When this tactic failed, she began meeting with prison psychiatrists, claiming to be insane to the point of psychosis, with symptoms including a tendency to hear voices. One of her personalities was named Billy. November 2nd, 1984, the day of Velma Barfield's execution. Among the witnesses was Anne Graham, daughter of Billy Graham. All Velma wanted for her last meal was a can of Coca-Cola and a bag of cheese doodles. After all, there are no pleasures more gratifying to a junkie than their drug of choice. She met her end via lethal injection. Fitting, considering that she had dispatched so many people with a poisonous substance. One less toxic person on the planet. It was no loss. The following is a news segment by a station in Raleigh, North Carolina, featuring an interview with Velma Barfield.
Velma Barfield was convicted and sentenced to die in 1978 for the poisoning death of her boyfriend. She also admitted poisoning 3 other people, including her mother. Barfield had been awaiting her sentence in the Women's Correctional Facility in Raleigh, but last week, for security reasons, say corrections officials, she was moved to Raleigh's Central Prison, where she is the only woman prisoner. She now waits in virtual isolation in a cell just across from the execution chamber, a constant reminder, she says, of her likely fate.
It's total, isolation from everybody that I had been with for almost 6 years. The first week I was here was the worst week that I have spent. Everything
Barfield
about
says
it.
drugs led her to prison. She became addicted to tranquilizers, she says, during a rocky period in her life.
The last 10 years was just like that, years of a drug nightmare. Days of not knowing where you are or what you've done.
Her attorney would not allow her to say whether she knew what she was doing when she committed her crimes. But once confined in prison, Barfield says, she found God. It's her relationship with God, she says, that has enabled her to survive her confinement.
Living in prison every day is a struggle, even at its best. And I know that without him and his strength that has sustained me, I couldn't have made it even thus far.
Now, drug-free, a repentant Barfield says she regrets the pain she has caused others.
I'm sorry for the hurt that I've caused so many people. Today, if it were possible, I wish that I could take every bit of hurt on myself.
Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.